Hey everyone, it's Dr. Johnston, and today's featured crime analysis is pretty unusual because I'm just going to talk for a minute and then I'm going to play an interview for you that I had with a woman who was married to a minister for 19 years and was subjected to domestic violence throughout that time. The reason I'm doing this is for a couple of reasons. One, it's piggybacking off of episode 10, which is the case of Stephen and Amy Allwine. And Stephen Allwine was a church leader who kind of carried on this facade of being this very deeply spiritual or religious man. He was also doing things like having affairs. He went on the dark web and attempted to put out a hit on his wife and actually paid money for it. Fortunately, it never went through. And he ended up murdering his wife, who apparently had no idea at all that this was going on. So I'm not certainly suggesting that people who are religious or have faith or are spiritual have some kind of special predisposition to violence. But what I do think and have observed during the course of my career is that sometimes individuals who are religious leaders who do engage in these behaviors, who do have these propensities, have a place to hide. And they often find that, and they often find ways to use their spirituality to justify the things that they do. And so the interview you're going to be hearing is with a woman who was married to a minister for 19 years and was a victim of domestic violence pretty much the entire time, and who also says that she was complicit in the sense of not coming forward and reporting her husband for a number of really terrible things that he did. And that's one of the hardest things for me, I think, in my career, in seeing individuals who were married to maybe a preacher, minister, and it comes out that there was sexual abuse in the family or physical abuse in the family, and yet oftentimes other church leaders knew this was going on. The family certainly knew it was going on, and there was this kind of concerted effort to conceal it. And that's really the thing that is challenging for me and probably is for a lot of people. So I'm going to ask you, as you listen to this interview, to, I guess, do a couple of things, maybe think through your own experiences with your faith and your spirituality and the messages and the teachings that you get, but also to withhold judgment, because the person who's going to be talking, named Ruth, certainly was a victim of domestic violence. And she also didn't do some things that she now wishes she had done to protect her family and also to protect a foster child that you'll hear about. So I think it takes a lot of courage to come forward and say, these things happened to me and here's my part in this. And so I think the more that we can, I guess, embrace and give people permission to say, I made a mistake and here's how I'm trying to move forward, I think it's a lot better than, being judgmental and being critical, because I don't think that anybody wins in that situation. So anyway, I'm going to stop and let you listen to my interview with her, and I look forward to reading your comments and questions afterwards. Thanks. Our guest today is Dr. Ruth Tucker, formerly a professor of mission and church history at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's the author of more than 20 books, including Black and White Bible, Black and Blue Wife. Welcome to the show, Ruth.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your upbringing in terms of your religious background.
Well, I grew up in a fundamentalist church. I say that, broadly speaking, an evangelical church. And I look back fondly at memories of the little country church started by two lady preachers, although when the church was formally pulled together, they had a succession of male ministers.
Okay. And so it was obviously a big part of your life growing up.
It was, and it was through my college years, and after getting out of graduate school, I began teaching at a Bible college and then Trinity Divinity School and Calvin Theological Seminary. I was married to a fundamentalist minister for 19 years.
And was he the subject of your book that I want to talk to you about?
Yes, he very much is the subject of Black and White Bible, black and blue wife.
So tell me about this book and the message that you think is important for people to know in it.
Well, if you'd asked me 20 years ago if I would ever write such a book, it would be stunning to even think about. But after word began leaking out from various sources that there's a lot of abuse in the churches, I decided that I would write my story. And it is my story, but I have diary entries from way back, and also my son, who had to interview with a New York attorney before the book came out, just so that there was verification for a lot of things that I said. And I told about the physical abuse particularly, but also the psychological abuse that I experienced through my 19 years of marriage.
When did the abuse start?
Almost immediately, the psychological abuse. We were on our honeymoon, and I was so hungry, and it was about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and I said, we were going through Montreal, and I said, there's a hot dog stand. And back then, this was in 1968, I think they were 10 cents, 15 cents, and he said, no, we will eat at dinner. We'll go to an all-you-can-eat place, and that should tide you over until tomorrow evening. And I mean, I was stunned. This was and I said, well, I have some money. I'll pay it with, this is money that I had earned. I'd been working all summer, but it was a stunning situation. And from there, it led to other little things, not necessarily physical abuse right off the get-go, but it certainly led to other forms of abuse that I had been in the habit of sending a gift box to my family, sometimes homemade things, sometimes I would buy and I'd send it home, not particularly on Christmas and holidays. It was just I wanted a surprise. And again, he put his foot down on that, and it was shocking to me. But, you grow up learning the wife is supposed to submit to the husband. I'm not what somebody would consider a submissive type person. And that was very difficult for me. I had just assumed there would be partnership in this marriage, but it seemed to change so quickly after we said our vows.
And how did your ex-husband now justify this?
Well, through biblical passages. He had memorized a lot of scripture, not just that the wife should submit to the husband. And he could proof text anyone down on any subject, and certainly on wives' obedience. And in Ephesians, it talks about slaves being submissive to their masters even when they're beaten, and that was essentially his argument.
So is this something that you believed or accepted?
Well, we went through our marriage ceremony, and I did say I would obey. That was long part of a woman's response. It was part of the Anglican Church marriage ceremony, the wife obeying the husband. So I went through it. I often kind of kidded myself later, well, I had my fingers crossed or something, but I guess for some reason, keep in mind, my husband was a very charming, personable individual. He took a pastorate early in our marriage. There were 4 other candidates, and he was the one chosen. He was a good speaker. He was personable. He was friendly. And somehow that won me over, a handsome, tall, dark, and handsome man. And I knew that he'd had serious problems before we were married. He had been kicked out of 2 Christian colleges. He had been arrested as a peeping Tom. Nevertheless, he promised this was over. This was totally behind him. And I quickly realized that he had very serious problems besides his strong demand for obedience. But even individuals today, ministers today, and you read them online, who demand that a wife obeys her husband.
How was he able to get a church if he had been arrested for being a peeping Tom and had been kicked out of 2 colleges?
Well, they were independent churches, and I think, and even the Southern Baptist Church and other denominations are independent enough, and even when they're not fully independent, like the Southern Baptist Church today, you see of cover-ups all the way through.
I mean, that is not only surprising to me, it's shocking. I mean, it's scary.
Well, it is, and I say move through the system. It's hardly a real system. Denominational churches with strong oversight, it may be more difficult, but come on, the Catholic Church knows all kinds of things, and what do? They put a priest in another parish. So, and the Southern Baptists, they send a minister on to another church. It's throughout the Christian movement. So, if we're following the news, we know all about the religious cover-ups.
That's definitely true. So when did the physical abuse start?
Oh, it started within 2 or 3 years, or maybe before that, pushing me, making demands that I talked back on. And so it started fairly early, and it was continuous. And he would sometimes say he was sorry afterwards. He one time, when I said, if this ever happens again, after he beat me up, I said, I will call the police. And he said, that will be fatal. And my son heard it. He'd seen the beat up and he'd heard it. And he challenged his dad the next day. You threatened to kill Mom. And he said, well, he tried to talk out of it. His terrorism and threats were worse than just a plain beat up. He could throw me down and kick me. He could squeeze my arms and twist my arms so that I had black and blue marks for days. I would wear long shirts. I covered everything up. I mean, I was complicit in the whole thing. I was covering up my beat ups. I never would have told anyone. But he always tried to deny things afterwards, or say that I took it in the wrong way, or that I had provoked him. And provoking was his favorite line, that if I had not talked back or said what I said, he wouldn't have beaten me up.
Did you tell anybody this was going on?
No. I was a minister's wife. I was an evangelical fundamentalist minister's wife. There's nobody to tell. I couldn't tell my family. We were told that this would bring shame on the cause of Christ. This was the line from that I learned as a little child, that you never bring shame on the cause of Christ. So you never tell anyone about the great sins within the Christian church.
What about your son? Like, how old was he during this period of time?
He grew up with it. We escaped, my husband, Randy Tucker, when Carlton was 13. He was 13, and I knew at that time he would be able to testify before a judge. Before that, there were limitations on what children could do. So I often think I waited too long because it didn't help him at all to see this terrible abuse. But I did, for good or for ill, I waited until then, and he testified before the judge. My biggest fear, my absolute fear, was that because he's so charming and well-spoken, the judge would give him joint custody with me. It turned out that the judge asked him about it, what he would do if it was joint custody, and he said, I would run away to Chicago. I was stunned in listening to that. I'd never heard anything like that, but he knew of a place not too far from Moody Bible Institute, and he said I would be able to stay there. I could find somebody to stay with. And it was an incredible scheme. Well, that obviously clinched the deal that my husband did not get joint custody. But I think an awful lot of women stay silent. They absolutely fear. Because of that, I have had women stop by. I have a little shop these days, and I have women stop by here and tell me horrible stories, but then just insist I never say a word. I don't even tell their stories without names. They are so fearful of their husband, of the marriage, of the custody issue.
How did this impact your faith?
Oh, it certainly doesn't help any at all, and I suppose people would certainly challenge my evangelical faith today in some ways, and it's not just my personal story, but all kinds of stories that are coming out within the Southern Baptist and every church you can imagine, and the cover-ups. I don't know. It does not. You wonder about almost anyone. Is what they claim is real, or is it put on? Is it a cover to get by with things?
Because I'm wondering, you're in this relationship with this man who's psychologically, physically abusive. You're watching him get up and minister or preach every Sunday. I just can't imagine the disconnect that would cause.
Well, I will, after I had found out he had abused our foster daughter, and I'll talk about that in a moment, I could not listen to him preach. So I volunteered to take over the nursery full time. And we had a little nursery, and I was able to get out of church and tell these little children's stories, and I did not have to hear him.
So tell us about the experience with your foster daughter.
Dina was a foster daughter, and she was 12, 13 when she came to live with us. She'd had a lot of problems before, and I felt that I could make a difference. And at that time, this sounds just insane, but I thought his apologies had somehow made a difference. I had known of absolutely no sexual abuse for him. At any rate, things seemed to go well. We gave her a lot of freedom. We made her save half of the babysitting money that she got. So when she left our home, she had a bike, a sewing machine, a bank account, luggage, none of which she came in with. She came in with a bag of old clothes. So on the level of that how you would judge it on the books, it looked good. It looked like we were good foster parents. She left our home quite suddenly. She had some issues, and I talked to her about her case with caseworker. I talked to him about it, and he was aware that there were some issues with her, that she was acting out and that. And it was one afternoon, I had called her in from across the street where she often babysat, and our son was little, and he was taking a nap, and I said, I'm running across to the store to grab some milk and some other things. I just want you to stay in the house until I get back. And I said, and by the way, I said, don't let him, it was the man next door, don't let him pat you on the butt like that, like he's doing. I said, just slap him when he does something, or tell him you won't come over again to babysit if he keeps doing it. And she said, well, all men are like that. And I said, all men, what are you talking about? Can you imagine Dad ever doing that? I literally said that about my husband. We were mom and dad. I said, can you imagine? And she said, yes, I can. And her voice broke, and she said about 2 incidents. And I knew she had lied to me a number of times, but I knew positively that was not a lie. I was so stunned. My mind was so fried that I left her in the house. I walked across to buy the milk. It was less than 2 blocks away, across a highway. My mind was so fried, I was going across the highway, and a truck put its horn on, and I backed up. I didn't know what I was doing. I got that milk and what I needed. I came back, and I didn't say anything to her. I didn't acknowledge the truth of it. I said nothing. But I called the caseworker, and said, I want to talk. I think it's time for her to move on. And my husband was away. He was going to further seminary education. He did not come back until the following day. And I was so livid beyond rage. Never in my life have I've been so angry. He did not deny it. And she left a couple of days later. And I mean, it was extremely painful thing. I wept. She did not. She just was very silent. She packed up her bike, and the caseworker had a van and her sewing machine and all her luggage and all the things she's accumulated with us. And that was the end. And I was complicit in this crime. I did not report it. I did not report it because of my own, it was a very selfish thing. Had I reported, the news would have been out, the horrible shame. My husband probably would have gone to jail, which he deserved, and there was no sense at all that I didn't want him in jail for life. I was so angry with him. I had a baby, toddler, and it was self-serving what I did. I demanded, it was through a series of things, that he go take lie detector tests for every few months and answer certain questions. I can't imagine that was helping at all. But I mean, it's the guilt that I feel to this day about Dina and the abuse, and that I was complicit. I didn't report her. I sought to look her up several years later after my son and I had escaped the abuse, and learned. I kind of dreamed that I could find her, and maybe she would have children. Maybe she would be not much money. She might be a single parent, and I would want to take her out to Sears, buy her a washer and dryer. I just dreamed of doing something like that because I had gotten on my feet after the marriage ended, and I had saved something, and I just so badly wanted to establish a relationship with her. And I learned that she had been coming back from college some years earlier and gone off a bridge, and it was icy. The bridge was icy, and that she was drowned in her car and not found until spring. And that was such, even to this, I'll never get over. I dedicated my book to the memory of Dina, but and I spread the word, and I spread my complicity, and there are women out there, pastors' wives, who are complicit. And I never covered up in the sense that I lied, and when I was asked about abuse, but I didn't report him, even though she got out of our home and hopefully she was in a safer place. I did not report him, and I never begged forgiveness from her while she was living for not, when I learned, when she told me that afternoon, for not right there saying how terribly sorry I was and that I believed every word she was saying. I did. I believed it, but I didn't tell her that. And the only thing I could ever do for the memory of Dina is to tell my story.
That takes a lot of courage.
Well, it would have taken a lot of courage if I had stood up right at the moment, and I didn't do that. But I want ministers' wives, I want Christian wives, I want people, anyone who knows of abuse, to report it.
So let me ask you this question, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges for people hearing the story, is to kind of go, okay, is your ex-husband, do you think he really has faith, or is the church kind of some avenue for getting power and getting some kind of recognition? Because it's so difficult to make sense of these kind of actions Well, I mean, we all make mistakes for sure, but this is somebody that you're describing who not only does all these things, but justifies them, doesn't seem to feel any remorse for them, um, to use his faith to do these things. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't have an answer for that. Yes, he used the Bible to proof text what he was doing, but I know of two ministers out in Colorado who were put out of their church. They were certainly very well known in their local mega churches, and Ted I'm forgetting his name. He was in Colorado Springs for many years, and he was having relationships with gay men, and yet preaching the gospel every Sunday. I can't explain it.
Well, so there's that part of it, and I've worked with enough sex offenders to understand that there's many reasons and explanations and psychological issues that go along with sex offending. In some respects, that part of it is easier to understand than the cover-up and the complicity that goes
Well,
along
it
with
is.
it.
It is. And there's just cover up from the top to the bottom so very often in our evangelical denominations and the independent churches and the Catholic Church, in all churches. It's just, it's hard to know. How do the Catholic priests do it? I can't explain it.
So how did you break away?
My son had been begging me to leave his dad because there had been a lot of abuse, and a kid should never have to watch it. And one time it was a Mother's Day, and my husband and I had gotten into an argument, and he said, "Why don't you behave like a submissive wife and go wash the dishes?" And I said, "Hey, I will," because he wouldn't let me wash the dishes. He had this waterless method, and I said, "I will." And I went into the kitchen, and he said, "Get away from there." And I said, "You told me to wash the dishes, and I will." I was angry. And he warned me a couple times, and then he hit me over the back with his arm. He's tall and very strong. As hard as he could, I just fell to the floor. The wind was knocked out of me. Our son Carlton helped pick me up and get me upstairs. I mean, my back was, he had just knocked me out. And Carlton came up later. I was lying in bed, and he asked me how I was, and he was so sympathetic. But then he said, "Mom, it was your fault. You should have immediately left when he told you to stop washing the dishes." And I realized then what I had put this child through. So again, I keep saying I should have gotten out earlier, but if he had gotten joint custody, which he might have, if my son hadn't testified, it could have been far worse. So you try to make decisions, and you realize that an awful lot of decisions you're making are self-serving, because even when I did escape him, there were a lot of people who were just stunned, including my family. He was so personable and charming, and there were people that were absolutely stunned and blamed me, and I knew that would be what I had to go through. My family, however, when they heard, they were incredible. It was a Christian community that was far less so, because they knew this charming individual. However, he had been fired, but again, we covered things up. He actually ended up being fired at two churches and at a school and a publishing company. And until I was separated from him, this had all been kind of covered up. He could get another job with his charm, and again, that happens.
So what do you think should be done? I guess as individuals, maybe listening to this show, what can we do to start changing that?
Well, I think the answer is the Me Too movement, and for leaders in churches, but until they determine they're not going to be complicit, I can't say what should be done. All I know is that I have to tell my story when I have every opportunity, and hope that in some little way it might change somebody's mind.
The other thing that kind of comes to mind is there certainly are the individual situations of abuse and, misconduct that clearly need to be dealt with openly and with transparency. But I almost wonder, Ruth, that some of the teachings that start with children are almost like grooming for some of these things. I was very fortunate looking back. I grew up in a Baptist church for a significant part of my life, and my faith has changed over the years. But I remember a couple of things. One, our minister would always say to us that nobody should ever come between your relationship with God, that you are in charge of that, and that if somebody in your church, in your community, is saying one thing and doing another, you need to pay attention to that. And so, I think there are ways for faith to be communicated that really empowers men and women to trust themselves to know, what's right and what's wrong and what's abuse and what's not.
And I think you're right. And I think it's the quote unquote secular world who has really come powering through on that little children be taught that. And hopefully that's happening in Christian churches, but there are a lot of evangelical churches that are still demanding wives be submissive, and little girls hear that very same thing, that submission is so important. And it's very difficult, especially if it's in the family, if it's a parent, if it's a brother, that abuse. It's in the military, it's in the corporate world, it's in politics, it's everywhere. But the church has the best means of covering up, I believe, because it can be put in some sort of a spiritualized context.
Yeah, that's a very powerful way to deal with things. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of opposition when that's used. It's very difficult to break through that. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on today and telling your story, because as I said earlier, it's not a story that many people want to tell and are willing to tell. And I think your voice is ultimately going to make a huge difference to people listening. And I just want to thank you for your courage, Ruth, in coming on today.